take your seats, ladies and gentlemen. Take your seats. Mr. Machado, Mr. Michael.
It's tough.
By the way, ladies and gentlemen, an announcement for all of you to learn the secret of Delta levies. On Wednesday, February 15th, starting at 6 p.m. at the State Library downtown, 900 N Street, George Basie, a name known to you, will be releasing his just-produced book and providing us with a speech entitled Sacramento River's Renegade Flood Control System and Why We Are Lucky to Have It. It is, Joe, I'll forward one of these things to you guys, and it's worth posting on the web. George has written widely in the subject and represented half the people in the room at one time or another over the last 50 years.
Major part of the North Delta Water Agency's contract.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Anyway, okay. We are back up. Our DVD now has 4 hours of time, but we are not going to occupy all of that tonight. Obviously, we have till 6:30 at the latest here, and we have to honor that. Don was about to raise some questions when we adjourned.
Yeah, and I think certainly some of the dialogue has brought out some of the points I wanted to touch on. But I just, as I've thought about certainly 1.1 and 1.2 under the levies, one being the point about the 8499 standard for all the levies, and secondly, obviously, improvement of the lowland levies and other areas. That part of the context I kind of weigh this against, and again, some of the questions brought it out. One is that the length of the plan. We're talking about a 9-year plan, and over time, the plan will be amended or adjusted as new information and other studies become available. But part of that is that, and certainly as the Commission has debated this, but as I bring it into the context of the Delta plan, is that funding uncertainty, that's a fact of life, and I think certainly to Dan's point about you don't want to set unreal expectations from a lot of different vantage points, and I think we can recognize that funding uncertainty is going to be with us for a long time to come. But there are certain charges that have been given to this council and certain charges given to state departments and given to other entities to carry out and fulfill, and some of them are going to be very funding dependent, and levies would be no different. And I guess my view, certainly, kind of taking this statewide interests into account, that we can debate to a lesser or greater degree what those might or might not be and how liability might extend to them. But when you look at just what the state has invested, that's part of the reason the charge for this council and taking on the co-equal goals is to find a plan that addresses that. But you look at, just as we've heard presentations to the better part of today about state-owned lands, if you just simply took that, and whether it be used for recreational purposes or islands that are purchased to have a better vantage point as it relates to maybe habitat restoration and or for purposes of making sure that the reliability of the water supply is currently banks upon the through Delta conveyance, that they have certain islands that are strategic and so forth. And so I think that if you set a floor, and if HMP is the floor, that people would work to that and maybe not much beyond that, not that necessarily you discourage that. And so it seems to me that if you put your floor at a different spot, that people continue to work towards that for the reasons that certainly the ESP has outlined, I think, but I think that they come into the broader context of the plan, hopefully, that you look at what it is you're protecting and how you meet those co-equal goals. And so obviously this isn't any final determination about consistency or not. I guess I see this, if you want to use funding uncertainty as being, the driving factor, or some liability is taken on by the state as being a reason maybe not to enter this, then you can make that argument and probably make it fairly easily. But if I look at this in the context of a 9-year plan and what it means to not just statewide interests, but I think to the broader interests of the Delta, which, after all, that's what the Delta plan is designed to do, is to not only protect the Delta, but to promote the co-equal goals and to meet it with the qualifiers. I think that having, again, certainly having the staff analysis is important, but it is a policy discussion for this council, and that it's not, I don't see it as being contrary to what we're trying to achieve here, recognizing the limitations. But there's limitations in a lot of things we've talked about as far as policy recommendations that the council's going to be making, and certainly from the standpoint of the commission's report here before us today. So it wasn't so much a question, Mr. Chair, just I think reflecting on why I think that this has certainly a high level of importance, because the last point I would make is that depending upon what we do with some of the recommendations and strategies that are brought forward here, it does impact, I think you rightfully said, Dan, other chapters in the Delta Plan. And depending upon what policy choice we may make about this, it may or may not drive some of the things that will, one, certainly affect, economic vitality, but also I think some of the things that relate to habitat restoration and ability to maintain a real focus on that over time. I think Dr. Pike addressed that in some of his last responses to Member Johnson's question. So I think this is really important. And again, we're not going to make a decision today, but to me, if we were to find these inconsistent and to leave them out of the plan, I think it has a diminishing effect on some of the other things that I think are very critical in the Delta Plan, but certainly to what was before you today. So that's kind of where I'll leave it for right now.
Okay.
That wasn't meant to be the final word.
Yeah, well,
got kind of quiet in here.
But it was useful, and it was given in an authoritative tone that suggested, by God, that was it. And you're a supervisor. We're supposed to pay attention. I think we ought to get through all of these levy, the 8 recommendations under the levy, and just raise some comments and questions. Obviously, we're not voting. We're going to come back for another meeting where we will hopefully have focused down the issues, the differences, the similarities, some language, and so on, and then decide what to do. But I don't know, Dan and Mike, maybe you just ought to lead us through the next few and see if you get any questions or comments. And remember, I do recommend you consider the matrix that was part of the cover memo Mike prepared, as well as Dan's matrix, because together they provide both the background information and our staff's report, and I think it's wise to look at both at one time. I took mine out and borrowed paper clips from the ladies to keep all the papers together. Okay. So,
and maybe let me see if I'm hearing some additional information that would be useful to bring back to you, and we consider this again the next time. I think, one, it would be important to make sure we understand this within the context of current state priorities, like what are we doing now, which I think is HMP. So what is the implication of setting our sites up to PL 8499? To think through the difference between a long-term goal and near-term funding priorities. Maybe there is a way to bridge this gap here. There may be some places where to meet other priorities in the Delta Plan, perhaps habitat restoration or other objectives, there may be a desire to say these are places we don't believe levies should be increased to PL 8499. And then I think there's the final point that I'm hearing is let's think through how this fits into an overall strategy for investment in project levies, urban levies, and the lowland levies.
I just want to add 2 overall thoughts on the thing. I keep going back to our statute and what we're supposed to do, and the code section 85306, council in consultation with the flood board shall recommend in the Delta Plan priorities for state investments in levee operations, maintenance, and improvements in the Delta, including both levees that are a part of the state plan of flood control and non-project levees. It is covering all the territory and pretty much the basic questions. Pretty clear that our recommendations on priority for state investment are not based on an evaluation of levies. We've gotten a potpourri of information, including the report earlier today from the Department of Water Resources, but the reality is everything's all over the map. We've got cost estimates that range from low to not low. We've got different plans at different places. But we have an obligation to make recommendations for priorities on levee investments, operations, and maintenance, and that is the focus. And my impression is in our levee section, we're really going to stage our approach. And so it seems to be we have made recommendations. For example, the recommendation on the levee subvention program continuing is a small step in the right direction. But the clear evaluation, the focus on the maps that Eric Nickel took us about, mentioned to us, and trying to digest all of this is going to take a lot of time, a lot of work, a lot of effort, and it'll be brutal because everybody on all sides always negotiates for positions, and you got to use my methodology and my standards and my maps and all that kind of stuff. But we can have perhaps a more direct conversation than DWR could on the preparation of the flood plan, because they punted a lot of these questions, saying it should be done, but not doing it. And I think this is one of the areas where the legislators who were paying attention decided, God, we don't have the ability, willingness, or time to do it, and nobody else has either. Maybe if we give you guys a mandate like this, you can come up with some semi-coherent plan. I think that's the way we're headed. The other thing on this is there are other issues we'll review, but we need to make sure that we're talking about the same things at the same time. I mean, people use different words and different categories, and I think we will find that all these studies and all these maps have variations, problems. Once we post it, I'll bet you Nikki Sward will find 17 errors on each of the maps, and it'll be the council's fault, the Delta Protection Commission's fault, DWR's fault, and she'll be right on some of those errors. And, that's the kind of examination of this information we actually need. Yes, and Bob, we're going to send her to you for negotiations of all these issues. And thank you for volunteering that time. Seriously, that process will be helpful, letting people vet, and if we can figure out how to make those maps interactive so people can focus down easily and simply on stretches of island to the extent that aerial survey information allows it, maybe that's a useful tool that all of us could benefit from. So I think we're headed toward this process, and staging on levee standards is certainly consistent with the statute. And I'm willing to be slightly adventuresome, but I must confess I'm cautious on major policy commitments directly or indirectly without understanding the implications and the financing. Although I noticed some of the folks in the audience from water exporters smiling at what I just said, I am also concurring with Mr. Machado that all the people who benefit from these activities, whether in Delta, upstream, or exporters, and the collected people of California have to play in the game. It isn't sensible any other way. And that's one of the things, if we do this half-assed well, the Delta Plan might do, is continue to point out that everyone is part of the solution, because everyone has a share of causing the problems we all face.
Could I just make a comment to put the costs into perspective? I know that you have to wrestle with this. I know that Joe is correct that between yourselves and the rec board or whoever you have to work with on this prioritization, it will take more than half a day. My point was just that it doesn't require a 5-year, $20 million study. But to put it in perspective, San Francisco PUC is currently doing a seismic upgrade to the Hetch Hetchy system. It is the next to last seismic upgrade of infrastructure in the Greater Bay Area following the 1989 earthquake. Well, it's about even Steven with the BART upgrade. It's taken 20 years to do those upgrades. The one remaining seismic upgrade in the Greater Bay Area that's needed is the Delta Levee system. But to put the costs in perspective, San Francisco PUC is spending $4.6 billion on Hetch Hetchy alone. So if you folks with all your beneficiaries can't figure out how to raise $4 billion over a period of time, I'd be surprised.
Because all the beneficiaries and the stressors believe that the others should pay the full cost,
well, I know
not themselves. And that seems to be a problem in modern society, Bob. I don't know how to get around that. But yes, there is a point of time where people who are interested in results come to a table grumpily, unwillingly, and one of those ugly solutions emerges. Maybe BDCP is one of those issues. I don't have any idea, one of those occasions. But we don't have access to pile hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to authorize. That is not what we're doing. Ours is a planning effort, and it's a planning effort with some statutory constraints, but focuses all. So we're giving folks our best advice in adopting a plan that, as best we know, serves the co-equal goals and the other elements that are in this statute. Mr. Grindstaff.
I'd just like to add that during the break, I spoke with Senator Machado, and we're getting together this next week. We'd actually planned it before this. I think this meeting has been very useful to me, even up to this point, and I think I'm hopeful that we'll make progress, and we'll see what we come back with and see if we can't come up with something that is useful for the council.
Don.
Yeah. I would just say that I would certainly concur with what Joe just said about. I think it's been very useful. But what Dan said a moment ago, I think certainly about having. He didn't say exactly this way, but some benchmarks, and also looking at those levies. And again, we've gotten better information as of today. Just some mapping information as to, again, this is going to be a multi-year, probably multi-decade approach. And some things can't wait that long. Other things may just have to, because out of necessity, whether you can find $4.5 billion now or cumulative over time, if that's what it takes to achieve a certain standard, then that's what you work towards. I would just say that I wanted to point this out because it didn't get too much play today, although I think it's been touched on, and certainly I know that Joe, you had many months ago, and some of the white papers about the plan. Number 4 under the levy recommendations with the recommendation for a regional agency that would have some authorities to raise funds and to allocate, as well as to, I think, bring about some regional coordination. There was a good deal of debate at the commission level, as Dr. Michael and Dr. Pike and Mike all recall, about what that meant, because I think from a local perspective, and even from the state agencies, again, that may not have been a novel idea, but it was one that folks are looking at, potentially another governmental entity, and they're going to do what, and what other responsibilities get shifted or authorities get shifted. But in the end, that's what we ended up in our recommendations and bringing forward here. And I think it was, again, that's just the first step, but I think it's an important step because it's a recognition that there is a sharing of not only responsibility, but a sharing of how the problem is going to be addressed, and ultimately that boils down to funding as well. And again, the secret's in what that ultimately is arrived at as far as the funding matrix.
For our purposes, we have a recommendation in the Delta plan on that issue now, but it's a relatively short recommendation. This suggests that, at least as I understand it, that long-term improvements of Delta levies and maintenance be controlled by the local assessment district. That's okay if you mean by that do you mean by that the Central Valley Flood Board projects as well? I mean, the point is the precise language you're suggesting wasn't clear to me, so I was drawn to Dan's comment, potentially consistent. I think that's right, but we've got to be clear on what it means and the obligations. And also, can you make sure that Senator Machado stays with the Protection Commission if they get this new entity, so he can be responsible for all of this?
But certainly, too, when you look at the lessons of Katrina, too, that's one of the big post-Katrina improvements in the lower Mississippi, was they went, in their case, to large levee maintenance authorities rather than the scattering of small levee districts that they'd had previously.
Let me just add, my reservations on adopting immediate standard that everybody ought to go to with the assumption the state's going to roll out a lot of money and Mr. Zlotnick's clients will roll out more is not one I will come to without some more thought. But the fifth recommendation, which is long-term funding for regular levee maintenance and expanded emergency preparedness response. To the extent the state of California is providing repair and maintenance ongoing obligations, it's almost impossible to imagine the circumstance that over time the state doesn't demand more and more requirement. I mean, it's hard to figure out how you don't get that. And I wondered about the language and whether emergency preparedness is slightly different because we have coordinating or collaborative agencies now with interlocking statutory understandings and a host of executive orders and all the other stuff that goes with it. But levies have always been kind of mucked up. And, I just suggest that some of the work on that may straighten it out if you draw the distinction so that it's an emergency response. I'm not positive, Mike, but that was my initial thought. I'll just zip through my thing. On 6, one-stop permitting, I like the idea a lot. I just make a note. If the intention here is the Delta Protection Commission does ecosystem restoration, it wasn't entirely clear in the matrix or the narrative, but I think it was suggested that in many ways the DPC might be an appropriate body for some, or if not all, of these activities that were mentioned. And in there was ecosystem restoration, and I don't know how that fits with the Conservancy, let alone how you would do restoration as a DPC.
I don't think necessarily meant to be the DPC.
Don't touch a button. Just get a little closer if you would, Mike.
Push the red button, please.
Push the red button. You may have locked it.
All
There
right.
you go. Okay.
The intent is that because of the overlapping jurisdictions and the difficulty to be able to get the applicable permits, whether it be for dredging, whether it be for any type of infrastructure work, and in some cases even ecosystem restoration, there ought to be a one-spot shopping that could help facilitate doing it. Not necessarily the DPC. It could be any entity that could carry out that function. Much like the model here that was discussed at the commission was much like you'd see when cities would undergo trying to facilitate a development in the city, and they would have a one-stop shopping where somebody could go in and walk everything through.
And of course, there are current authorities in state law that allow, I believe it's the Office of Planning and Research and the Governor's Office to assume that role for priority projects. It hasn't worked very successfully. I know back in the day when we were working at CalFed, we also spent a great deal of time, not successfully, trying to figure out how to put together one-stop shopping programs. Part of the challenge, of course, is you've got different levels of government, municipalities and counties and special districts and state agencies and federal agencies, all with independent time schedules and authorities, and it's incredibly difficult to actually find ways to organize that kind of one-stop process.
Okay. Just thank you very much. The last 2 recommendations responded to the science panel comment in particular, and I thought that was quite helpful, and I appreciate you doing that. Don.
No, I'm prepared to hear from some folks, I think.
Okay, I think so too. Pat, Gloria, do you have any questions at this time? We're going to get some public testimony next. Okay, all right.